Okay, so good morning, everybody, and good morning to you, Ines. I just want to say thank you so much for giving up your time today to talk to us on inclusion dialogue. And I'm really interested. I've been wanting to talk to you for some time. I'm really interested to hear your views on inclusive education and to hear about your work so far. Can I just start maybe by asking you, how did you end up working in this field and what's drawn you to this area of research?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. It's really nice to join such a nice lineup of names and interesting people talking about inclusion from across the world, really. What brought me to this field, I think, well, I studied to be a teacher, primary and lower secondary school teacher in Portugal. And I think from quite early on, when I did my school placements, I was always kind of uncomfortable with the way schools and teachers were responding to student diversity. And the one thing that I remember marked me a lot was that I was in a classroom and there was a student recently arrived from China without any Portuguese knowledge. And the teacher was desperate because they didn't know how to communicate to the student, and the student was really unhappy. And so, because when I finished my teacher education, we had too many teachers in Portugal. And so I thought I'll go to the UK and do a master's, which I focused on language, ethnicity, and education, because that was kind of the unsettling issue. Yes. And then from there, I realized that actually maybe it wasn't that, it was something else. So I went on to do another master's in inclusive or special education, inclusion and disability studies. And many years later, I'm still in academia and research. And it's something that really, I think, interests me and fascinates me. And I really enjoy working with teachers and thinking about inclusion.
It's interesting that your first example or insight in it was language related and not necessarily our disability category of need. As your career has progressed over time, do you see much change in how we view difference or diversity in our classrooms?
I think it has changed, definitely. And if I think back to my schooling years in Portugal, when I was in school, we didn't have students with disabilities in schools. Whereas nowadays, Portugal, the majority, I think 99% of students attend their local mainstream school. So definitely the context has changed a lot. And I think with regards to disability, the attitudes have changed a lot as well in Portugal. Not so much so with regards to ethnic diversity and language diversity. And there's still a lot of challenges. For example, when we think of the Roma community or students from certain backgrounds who come into school, and there's a lot of very deep-rooted assumptions that are a big barrier.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think even in these discussions on this podcast, that is possibly the final area of study that needs to be explored and looked at a little bit more, because I doubt Portugal is alone in that perhaps resistance or kind of cultural and attitudinal barrier that exists. I think in the Irish context it would be very similar, but I'm presuming that there's very little research done on kind of ethnic minority communities. Like we have the traveller community in Ireland. We've got a very limited amount of research on the education of travellers in Ireland, however.
Yeah, I think there are interesting kind of little groups that do some research to do with ethnic diversity and for example, the work of Artiles, Alfredo Artiles in the States, and how students from ethnic minorities tend to be more labelled as having special education needs than students from other backgrounds. I think there are some very powerful pieces of research, but yes, there are big challenges with regards to diversity, and I think the the challenges are not necessarily linked to just disability, but to many other aspects to do with language, ethnic diversity, gender aspects as well. So I think there's many aspects of diversity that our schools and our education systems are still not comfortable to respond to.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. You mentioned the Portuguese context, and I suppose over the past 12 months with this podcast and other work that I've done, there's a couple of case studies that are kind of used quite a bit in conferences and publications that have, I suppose, often described as achieved inclusion or further down the road of inclusion or further along in their inclusion journey, or whatever language you'd like to put on it. Italy being one of them, New Brunswick and Canada is often cited as well, but equally Portugal. And we've actually had representatives speak at a national conference here from Portugal about their system in an Irish conference. So can you just describe for maybe listeners that don't know much about the Portuguese education system, how is it considered inclusive compared to others?
I would say, I think I'm based in Glasgow, so in Scotland, and I would say probably Scotland and Portugal are both, in terms of policies, quite in a very positive place, in a very positive situation. I think the last changes to Portuguese educational legislation and policies have made a big step towards a more inclusive system, in the sense that we want to move away from the need to label students for schools to be able to respond and to support students. There's the curriculum, the national framework is actually a student profile which is very inclusive. And I can see many parallels between the Scottish context and the Portuguese one.
Interesting.
I think it's always interesting because then, as I do experience on a daily basis when I speak to my students in the Masters in Inclusive Education in Scotland, they come back from schools. Many of them are full-time teachers studying part-time, and they come back from schools and they've got a list of all the things that don't work and of all the challenges and of all the children that they feel are being left behind. But I think in Portugal, I think one of there's a couple of big, I think, contributors to the system trying to be more inclusive. One is definitely policies. The other aspect is this, I would say, in general, nobody would question that a student with a disability should go to a mainstream school. Nobody would say, oh, you can't come in here. And I think, again, that's very positive because it's a starting point at least. It doesn't mean that when the students are in the mainstream classroom, they're then learning and being included. And so that's part of the challenge, I think. The other side is how teachers very often, when you have very open policies in terms of, oh, okay, we don't need to label to respond, teachers sometimes feel a little bit lost, especially if they're not given the time and the support to work through these new policies and to see what they mean in their classroom. So if you go, and I would say both in Scotland and in Portugal, and you go and speak to teachers, you'll have many of them say, I don't know what to do. I have this student in my classroom and the policies may be shiny, nice policies, but I still don't know what to do.
And can I ask, I'm really interested in what you said there about schools kind of not, say, rejecting or creating a barrier for a student with disability attending. What has created that as the kind of status quo in Portugal compared to other countries where that's not necessarily true? Do you think? I mean, I know it's a big question, but
I'm not sure. I think part of it is that it connects with a little bit with the complexity of what that means. But sometimes I think what happens is if you then have students with disabilities in a classroom and you're told, look, they don't have to sit the same assessment as everybody else, or they don't. I think it lifts the pressure from teachers. Okay. I would say the way it is, it has been like that for a long, long time. So I remember the first students with Down syndrome coming to my school. And this was a while ago, let's say. And so, yes, so I think that one factor is time, definitely. The other is the fact that there's some of that pressure lifted of saying, if a student can't do it but has a disability, then it's not on the teachers. There's something explaining the difficulties that the student might experience, which has some, I think, problematic effects, because then you have lower expectations, not the same, maybe the same level of attention or support. So yeah. And
can I ask, are within that kind of more inclusive system, do special schools exist? Do special classes exist? Is there withdrawal for students with disabilities?
Special schools don't really exist, but we do. So in Portugal, what exists are schools that have special units. I'd call them probably units within schools for certain groups of students, mainly students with complex needs, sometimes students on the autistic spectrum.
Does it work? I'm sensing it's not as clear cut as perhaps a non-Portuguese person might kind of nearly want to assume. But is it working? Are students happy? Are parents happy? Teachers?
I think it really depends. I think it will always depend. And I think when we talk about inclusion, I always say complexity is something that you'll always have to deal with. And you can't really say, oh, everybody in the mainstream will be fine. I think we need to look at each student individually. And I think what happens in Portugal is you'll have some schools that are working really well, and the students and the families are very happy. And then some students who are being excluded from schools and being left behind. So I think you'll find a range. And one of the things I think is really interesting in terms of the way the Portuguese system seems to work in terms of school reforms is that very often they start with a group of schools that are considered to be pioneers somehow, or trialing something. And then the idea is that they'll be guiding the others. And so there's quite a lot, and in recent changes, there's quite a lot of openness and flexibility in terms of how the schools respond to their student body. And so what you can have is a school that really gets it, and they're doing the right things. And then a school, I would say actually a school cluster, because most schools in Portugal are organized into clusters that have from early years, primary, lower secondary, and they work. That this was done mainly for, I would say, admin purposes.
Right.
But actually, sometimes it works, and there's this notion that your school is part of something bigger.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite alien from an Irish perspective. Our sectors are very, they operate quite independently of one another. So yeah, you can see how that might aid, obviously, transitions for students, but maybe the implementation of policy. Yeah. Can I move on to some of your other work? And I know it's an interest of yours in individualized planning for students. Can I get your views on that?
Yeah. I always think that, and I remember when I started thinking about individualized planning, it was provided as the solve all problems solution in all the countries. You have an IEP, you have an individual education plan, and you'll be fine. And actually, I think my experience was that it actually can be just a piece of paper that you store in a cupboard for a year, and then you look at it later on. And so I think, as with all responses to student diversity, individualized planning can be used in a very inclusive way, or it can be used as a very exclusive thing, or it can be used, or it can be just a bureaucracy thing that's not useful at all for the classroom. Yeah. I think the same applies to other ways of responding to student diversity, like differentiation. You could have differentiation being used as a way to get all the students to be challenged and feel supported, but it can also be used as, we'll set the class into 3 ability groups, and then we'll have the average, the above average, the below average, and then the students will know. They'll know, oh, this is the Brainiac group. That was what my kids came home say, oh, she's in the Brainiac group. And so that's a way of doing differentiation that's not inclusive at all.
Yeah. And can I ask, regarding IEPs in general, what's your view? Do you think that each student, regardless of levels of need, should have them? Do you think it should be of use for parents, teachers, and students in which to set goals for students specific with disabilities? Or
I think IEPs or any form of individualized planning can be a very positive thing when they involve different people sitting together and saying, okay, what is the aim of education for this student, for this person, for this young person? And in that case, it can be very positive, because you'll have, if you have pupil voice and pupil involvement in thinking, okay, what is it that I want from school? What would be positive outcomes for me? And have a team of people that meet together. Whether that's realistic or not is another issue, I would say. But in some of the Scandinavian countries where there's more a tradition of having some form of individualized planning for all the students, not for only those with disabilities or additional support for learning needs. So what you have is, I think it's almost like a break moment where everybody, ideally what you would have is a break time where everybody sits down and thinks, okay, why we're here? What do we want to do in the coming months or in the coming year or something like that? And I think that's what the literature also shows, is that IEPs are a good thing when they are used to create conversations between the different people involved in education, the students, the parents, the teachers, other professionals who may take part in education for certain students. I think the challenge is that very often, and in many, many contexts, IEPs are an equivalent, because when I did my research, and for example, in England, there were so many different names: individual behavior plans, individual education plans, learning maps. So there were lots of different instruments, but I would say that I still call them forms of individualized planning. Yes. And the issue very often is that they accumulate many different roles. So they're used to get extra resources, for example, extra members of staff or a computer. They're used to monitor progress sometimes, because you set a target and then the student needs to achieve that target. And then they can be used for those conversations. And the accumulation of these different roles then becomes really problematic, because if a teacher will be judged based on whether the students achieve certain goals, what might happen is that those goals are set in a way that you know they will achieve them. So you lower the expectations. And so the problem with individualized planning very often is the IEPs is the accumulation of different roles within this one tool, and a lack of awareness of that.
Yeah, and I suppose what you're kind of getting into there is the level of autonomy at school level about how to use them. Certainly in the Irish context, we would have them similarly being used in very, very different ways. Can I ask, what do you think are the factors that shape the extent to which a school is inclusive or not? What leads to that in a school based on your work to date? What factors influence that?
Well, if I can take a step back, I always think, okay, the first thing I always need to do is define what I think of what are the main aspects when I think of inclusion in education. And for me, the main aspects are, for starters, access. And not just the physical access to a building, but the actual access to learning. And if we go back to the situation of a student with, for example, English as an additional language recently arrived to Scotland without any knowledge of English, that student, if we don't do anything, if we don't change anything in the classroom, that student might not be able to access learning. Then inclusion's not happening. So that's the access, not only the physical, but the actual access to learning. If we've got, I think, even more so now with COVID and young people having to learn from home, I think a lot of mental health and anxiety issues have been kind of made more visible, basically. And I think what we then have to think is, if a student can't physically make it to school without being so anxious, if they actually come to school, they might not be in a position to learn. And so it's again thinking of how can we get that student to access learning? Because at the end of the day, that's for me one of the key 3 pillars of when I think of inclusion in education. And there's really nice examples of, for example, there's a secondary school in here in Glasgow that they do think of education. It's beyond the school walls. It's not the school building. So they work with community support officers who may go and meet the students in a local library, for example, if they can't maybe physically come to school. So that's the first thing, access. The second one is participation. And again, I think of participation in 2 ways. On one hand is the taking part, and sometimes we think of the mainstreaming. We need to be in the mainstream classroom to take part in activities. But actually, I think it's more than that, and it has the individual perspective. It's the feeling part of something, because you could be in a mainstream classroom and not feel part of that classroom. And similarly, you could spend some time in the mainstream classroom and then work with a group of students outside and still feel part of that mainstream classroom. And I think for us to judge participation, we really need to engage with people's voice. Because it's a subjective perception, and that's the only way for us to know. The final one is success. And again, it's a very complex and charged concept, because success will mean different things for different pupils. It requires us to take a step back and think, okay, what's the purpose of education? What will success be? Is it the same for everybody? And I think for me, those are the 3 key aspects when I think of inclusion.
An inclusive school. Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. And I think I really agree with you about COVID. It's really shone a light on a lot of our practice to date, and how they can be flexible. We were forced into it, but they can be flexible, and it can often work. Ines, thank you so much. Is there anywhere, anything that I've left out of our conversation that you'd like to raise before I let you go back to your day?
I think touching on COVID there, it showed us how many different roles schools and teachers play. Because it's not just about the learning English and maths, it's so much more than that. And I think within Scotland, the issues to do with poverty, for example, and the realization that some students might go without a hot meal for the whole day if they don't make it into school. So I think COVID allowed us to see that in a clear light. But it also allowed us to see how we can work, or education can work with parents in different ways, and that we can provide learning in different ways. Some students may have found it very nice to be able to access learning from home, whereas for others was a nightmare. And so I think there's so many lessons that we could take from the COVID situation, but I'm not sure whether we will. And I do fear that we will go back to the way things are because they're just more comfortable.
Yeah, it's more convenient. It's a matter of watch this space though, isn't it? Just to see what the research shows about that time. But I can definitely draw similarities here in Ireland. Ines, is there anywhere that people can find out a little bit more about your work, or is there any piece of work that you'd like listeners to go to and maybe have a read?
I think probably through social media or tools on like my university profile. There will be, my most recent publications are around the situation in Portugal, but I do have things to do with individualized planning as well.
Brilliant. Okay, well listen, thank you so much. I really loved chatting with you, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Cheers.